Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this informal Scrutiny Leadership Board. If we can turn to item 1, declarations of interest. Has anybody got anything to declare?
No.
No? Right, thank you. The minutes of the last meeting held on the 11th of March. You're all happy with those? Right. Now we'll move on to item 3, capital strategy, and that is Steve. Thank you, Steve. If you could just all wait until he's done his presentation and then ask any relevant questions. I think that would be easier. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. This is the capital strategy which we took to executive 5 months ago. This is only the 3rd annual capital strategy that the council has produced. So this is a fairly new report that was introduced on the back of CIPFA and amending their prudential code. The prudential code first came in 2003, but obviously over the last 10-11 years of austerity, it's widely reported that some authorities have taken commercial activities perhaps a tad too far. And there's one authority in particular, Spelthorne, is often reported, as it was in the Municipal Journal. It's a district council adjacent to Heathrow, has borrowed something like 40 times its annual budget to invest in commercial activities. And as a result of this and others, CIPFA required local authorities to produce a capital strategy on an annual basis, and 2019-20 was the very first one that we produced. Although that might sound reactive, it is a very good document to have in place. The purpose of the document is to set out the long-term context for capital expenditure and investment decisions and how they're made. And I'm just reading this from the actual code itself, that it should give a high-level overview of how capital expenditure, capital financing and treasury management activity contribute to the provision of services, along with an overview of how risk is managed. So notwithstanding what's happened over the last decade, it is a good solid strategy to have in place. And we align it to the capital programme, which we produce on a 3-year rolling basis. So this particular capital strategy takes us from the current year 21-22 through to 23-24, and has really finessed the previous 2 years, which was very much a learning curve for all local authorities. The code requires us to specifically include first of all, capital expenditure and details of the overall governance process. In that, how a decision's made, what supports that decision making, what informs that decision making. It also looks on debt and borrowing and treasury management and the impact of those capital decisions on borrowing. It looks at commercial activities, and in particular Blackpool Council's approach to commercial activities, and I'll come back to all these in more detail as we review the document itself. It looks at the long-term liabilities, the consequences of those decisions. Fifthly, what knowledge and skills are required to make those informed decisions. And lastly, an assurance from the Chief Finance Officer, i.e. me, that affordability and risks are adequately reported and assurance given. So hopefully you have a copy of the strategy with the agenda, and I'll perhaps just do a page turn and list the main elements within that. And as Councillor Callow has said, it's an opportunity then for a wider discussion and specific questions, if that's okay. But I think, other than the background that I've just mentioned, I think first and foremost it's important to understand what is capital expenditure, what distinguishes capital expenditure from revenue expenditure. Well, revenue is typically the day-to-day revenue spend associated with maintaining services. Capital expenditure is something that is has a lifespan of more than 1 year, and in terms of a cut-off, such expenditure above £15,000. Now, there are elements of spend that can fall into both. For example, maintenance of a building. Maintenance of a building might bring you back to, or even enhance that building to what it was previously. So there is that grey area where you could actually revenueize or capitalize it, and that's a useful flexibility sometimes, because you don't always have the capital funds to fund the revenue, or vice versa, or the revenue funds to fund the capital. But it is easier to make a revenue to capital transfer than a capital to revenue. Looking at the types of investment, it distinguishes between service and commercial. When you hear the word investment, it almost conjures up something that provides a return. But I think it's important to note that that's not necessarily the case. There was a report went to executive last night around new homes at Grange Park. That is an investment in housing, and the HRA business plan ensures that investment washes its face over a period of time without necessarily making a surplus, and if it does, that is reinvested in housing. There are other investments that provide a social return. Investments in offices, for instance, provide a facility. It's still an investment. So please don't think when I use the word investment, it's all about creating a yield or a financial return. When you look at our commercial investments undertaken by our growth and prosperity team, there are probably only two that I could name outside the borough of Blackpool. Three if you include the airport, which is technically just over the boundary. One of these is Ribble House, based in Lytham, and the other one is a student accommodation called the Tram Shed, based in Preston. And in actual fact, these aren't necessarily assets that we own. We are just a head lease, for which we then sublease to create a surplus on those. And those really are the only two commercial investments outside the borough. Outside growth and prosperity, within my own property services division, we have a property investment portfolio, and within there, there's some very lucrative investments, and probably the two best ones in terms of financial returns for the borough are the Martin Mere Caravan Park, which had in fact a bumper year last year, and also the zoo, which itself is doing jolly well. Obviously within the property investment portfolio, any surpluses do contribute to the bottom line, but they're also reinvested in those properties as well. And occasionally we'll make a disposal and generate a capital receipt, and provision is set aside towards future maintenance. We're doing a current re-roofing scheme down Kent Road for 3 properties there within the portfolio. So it is important that we keep on top of the maintenance within them and keep them to a good standard. The strategy itself defines investment strategy across 4 different types of assets. There are operational assets, and that includes in particular office accommodation. We have community assets, investment in community assets such as our parks. We have regeneration assets, and there are quite a number of those being undertaken at the moment within Blackpool. And fourthly, we have investment assets. And in actual fact, when you look at what might be determined as a commercial investment asset, in the main, they're more regenerational, supporting the regeneration of the town. Within the strategy, I felt it was important to set a geographic scope. I've mentioned previously that the 2 investments outside the borough. We've set a scope of the Lancashire economic area, and the reason for that is that Blackpool is part of the Lancashire Economic Partnership, so it does actually make sense to align our investment scope across the Lancashire county. But in actual fact, I think other than those 2 assets that I mentioned earlier, it would be unreasonable to think that we would make any future investments unless there was a very strong strategic reason for doing so. Obviously, the last 15 months has created a lot of uncertainty in the property and valuation side of things, and we've set a threshold of a value of £500,000 for any assets above that. We actually undertake a revaluation on an annual basis. Below that, they fall under a 4-yearly revaluation cycle, which we undertake across all our assets. So we would do 25% each year, and that's a massive task in itself. But in doing that 25%, we also then have to make a judgment if any changes, any impairments, or in fact any appreciations might correlate or translate across any of our other assets, and that's for the purposes of our annual accounts. So our external auditors are particularly keen, perhaps more so than anywhere else in the accounts, other than the sustainability, around valuations of property, plant and equipment, and also pensions. The strategy also has a list of priorities for the council when acquiring property interests. That's at section 7, and that's effectively a checklist. So it covers things like covenant strength of a tenant. So it's all well and good leasing a property out to a prospective tenant. We have to assess whether that tenant has actually got the means to repay that rent over the lifetime of the lease. And the length of the lease is also a key factor. We've also got rate of return, risk, lease terms, growth, location, sector, building age and specification. So we try to be as comprehensive as possible within all that. In terms of funding property, there are probably 5 particular areas. One is receipts from sale of capital assets, and we're not very asset rich in terms of our ability to dispose. We sell strips of land here and there. On the whole, it's nothing like the major cities can generate in terms of capital receipts. We get external contributions from developers, such as Section 106 agreements. We can, as I said earlier, make revenue contributions or use our reserves. We do attract capital grants, and as we'll go on to the next report around outturn, last year we spent approximately £50 million on capital expenditure, capital investment, and nearly 50% of that came from external grant, which is an achievement in itself, because most of those we've had to bid for. And last but not least is prudential borrowing. And in all cases, we have to produce a business case for any capital investment, and the costs of the borrowing from that have to ensure that is at least met by the revenue income or any savings that will generate. It's worth mentioning also that our business loan fund, which is now a facility up to £200 million to support businesses in Blackpool, the funding for that is treated as capital investment, and the strategy does outline, in terms of governance, the corporate scheme of delegation, the levels at which agreement can be, or approvals can be made by either the chief executive, the cabinet member, or the cabinet itself. It also goes into some detail around the overall governance framework, which is strong and tight, and also the risk appetite. And there are numerous, and this isn't an exhaustive list of potential risks associated with capital investment, but lists such things as credit risk, liquidity risk, i.e. the risk of solvency, interest rate risk. That's something that's very topical at the moment as inflation creeps up by the day. There is a prospect that could push up interest rates, because that's the only tool that governments have to actually cushion the effects of inflation, though the Bank of England and other national banks have said they expect this just to be a one-off spike, and certainly the Bank of England have no intentions of increasing interest rates in the foreseeable future. Exchange rate risk can be a factor. don't necessarily contract with foreign countries, but sometimes the supplies of for building works may well come from abroad, and there is a potential exchange rate associated with that. So I have to take that into account. Inflation risk, construction inflation is certainly rising at the moment, actually far higher than the cost price index, and that too is a factor, alongside legal, regulatory fraud and corruption risks. So I think that probably covers the overall governance framework associated with that. There is an annex to the strategy which looks specifically at property investment strategy, and within there is some detail on the business loans that we've actually issued so far. So we're being transparent. Of that £200 million of business loan facility that we have, 127.5 as at the end of December had been approved across 9 particular companies within the town. But that is a facility and not necessarily the full drawdown by those companies. Proportionality is something that CIPFA is stressed within its code, and this is in relation to the point I made earlier about Spelthorne Council, and we've done some indicators here of the levels of commercial rent income in the context of our overall net service expenditure, which is well below the average. And I did come across a report recently that a potential funder of Blackpool Council has undertaken some due diligence, which reinforce that message as well. So we're certainly, in terms of proportionality, well below the average for our peer group. So that's the capital strategy. We will look to finesse and improve this as years go by. This is only the third one we've produced, but I think it does the job. It covers all the key parameters within the necessary governance framework for capital investment. And I'm happy to answer any questions or any comments that you might have in terms of how it could be improved.
Right. Thank you, Steve. That was very interesting. Thank you. I think you've indicated, Paula. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just unmuting myself. I think it's a really strong piece of work that really explained everything that you're about. Just for the inexperienced, you mentioned a Section 106 agreement with contractors. I didn't know what that was. Could you explain that for me, please? Thank you.
Yes, certainly. It's I'm not an expert, but it's generally a negotiated agreement they have with a developer, particularly a housing developer, where they will set aside monies or construct something like a park or social or affordable housing as part of the deal for developing that particular footprint.
Thank you.
And I think there are so many years in which you can spend that before it has to be handed back.
Right, Gerard.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Steve. Just a couple of questions, really. The loan side of things, are they fixed or are they variable? Do they increase at any time? Or can the length of the loan be extended? So obviously we've just come out of COVID now, and last year has been a major factor. The last thing I would mention is you mentioned that the loans are basically based on strategic significance. We've seemed to have loaned the Pleasure Beach or the Ocean Boulevard £12 million. I'm just wondering what the strategic significance of that £12 million is. It's also said it's set against secure assets. Would those assets be the park itself, the Pleasure Beach itself? Thank you.
Okay. Well, the Business Loan Fund was set up for to boost the economy, to create jobs within the town. And I know previous meetings you've asked, could this business loan fund be used towards COVID in terms of cash flow loans. That wasn't the purpose. In fact, the issuing of business loans actually dried up during the COVID period, as you would expect, with very little development or expansion taking place. We've tried to be as flexible as possible with prospective applicants. We do offer a fixed term loan. There are no penalties for early redemption, should that be possible. And in some cases where there may be difficulties with repayment or whatever other reason, COVID for instance, we provided, certainly last year, the offer of a 6-month holiday for capital repayment, though of course during that period the interest did accrue and that still has to be repaid. So provide a lot more flexibility than applicants could get from the banks, for instance. All loans have to be underwritten underwritten with other assets. I won't want to go into any detail on specifics in a public meeting like this, but I can assure you that is the case. And that's not just at the point in time of application as well, but we do have to consistently review that over time. And it's something that our external auditors ensure that we do, because of course that security could also be eroded, particularly during a period of COVID, and trip various thresholds and covenants. So yeah, there's quite a mini industry behind this.
Okay. Were you indicating, Lynn? I've got a little hand up on.
No, not intentionally.
All right then, thank you. Can I just ask you a couple of questions, Steve? On due diligence, we say where necessary, independent expert advice will be sought. Have you any indication of how much this would cost? And then on the business loans fund, it says here a number of small unsecured loans were issued to local businesses. Could you explain that and the amounts that were unsecured and why we did that? Thank you.
Yep, certainly. So for all of these, we do proportionate due diligence, and the costs of doing that are actually passed on to the applicant. Key area, obviously, is hotels. Our economy is predicated probably to the tune of going on for 40% on the tourism industry. So we've brought in commissioned hotel experts to undertake that due diligence, and they've drawn comparisons with hotels elsewhere around the country, for instance. So very much commissioned experts do that. Likewise with the Hounshill, we brought in experts in shopping centres to look at that, because we haven't got that specific expertise. But again, the costs are passed on. In our case, the Hounshill, we acquired ourselves, so the costs are apportioned over the acquisition cost of that. At the other end of the spectrum, as you say, there have been some smaller unsecured loans to businesses. As part of the due diligence for that, we have to ensure that these businesses are sustainable and will be able to afford to repay that. There have been one or two that have failed, but as part of the process, the level of interest rate that we charge reflects the level of risk. So that the higher the risk, the higher the interest rate, and within that return, we set aside a provision for bad debts. So for the couple or so that have failed, and they're very much at the lower end of the scale, we've made that provision. So there is some sort of cross-subsidisation within the business loan fund to meet that.
Do you indicate, the amount that we go up to on something that's unsecured?
Yeah, there is one that will be coming to the leader shortly for a write-off of £15,000. So that's roughly the max that we would go to in terms of an unsecured loan.
Right, thank you. Gerard, were you indicating? Oh, you've got a little hand on your screen. Has anybody else got any questions of Steve? Michelle, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Steve, where you've referred to loans for service purposes in section 3.2, it states that they're generally provided on a commercial basis and funded by borrowing. That borrowing, is that borrowing that we've taken, and is it at a fixed rate? And if so, how do the interest rates work? So if we're not on a fixed rate, and though that our borrowing could be subject to interest rate rises, how's that reflected in the loans that we then make against that borrowing? I hope that makes sense.
It does. Within our treasury management, we have a pool of debt, which is a whole mix from debt that was taken out many years ago. It still includes rates there of probably 8-9%. I don't think there are any in double figures now that have now dropped out. And at the bottom end, we've got probably 75% of our loan pool in temporary borrowing at very, very low levels of debt. But there will be some particular schemes, certainly that the high end ones, where there may be conditions on the tenants repaying us, and the first call being the call upon the debt repayment, where we would lock in that debt. So if you look at the Public Work Loans Board rates now for, say, 40, 50 years, you're looking at 2 to 2.5%. And in some cases, even though we could probably get short-term borrowing for a tenth or 20th of that, it makes prudent sense to lock that in over the long term to give you that certainty. But in the main, most of the borrowing, 75%, as I say, is on short term. And we're not alone in that. There are a number of authorities I know with far higher proportions. And although we borrow at 0.1%, our budget is based on a level of 1%. So we've got 0.9% headroom should rates start going up. And you would hope we would get some indication of that, and that rates would start to creep up rather than a step increase overnight.
Thank you.
Has anybody else got any questions at all of Steve? No? Right, thank you. Can we now turn to item 4 on the agenda? It's you again, Steve. It's a busy evening.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. This is the outturn report for last year that we submitted to executive last month. This covers both revenue and capital, and I'll perhaps start with capital first, since we've just been talking about that under capital strategy. Yes, last year we spent £49.9 million, which is pretty significant for an authority this size. The year before, the figure was 95 million, but that included the Hounds Hill within that. So year on year, roughly the same level of spend. And the funding for that, as I said earlier, nearly half of it came from external grant funding, which is great. It's free money for the authority, but does require some effort to pursue and win that. Prudential borrowing accounted for 13 million, and revenue contributions, though the bulk of that will come from the housing revenue account towards housing capital of £11 million. So that's the capital side. On revenue, much improved position at year end than we thought 12 months earlier. Back in April, May, this time last year, we were looking at forecast overspends of £20-30 million as a result of COVID. And at the end of the year, the outturn on COVID-related costs was 3.16 million. So a much improved position there. And if you recall, back in February, we brought a paper around restructuring our treasury management, which released close on £7 million, both in last year and in the current year. And that, together with improved performances in some of our revenue services, such as adult social care, actually generated a surplus last year of £4 million on our revenue budget of 142 million. So it's really bucked the trend nationally, where authorities have really struggled because of COVID, but that there are particular treasury management action certainly assisted. And whilst children's social care within children's services overspent by 1.1 million, across the social care, adults and children, we underspent by 1.8, which is a phenomenal achievement in the context. So that 4 million surplus takes our working balances to 6.3 million, which have carried forward into 21-22. So we're slightly above the target that we've set ourselves of 6 million. And on the earmark reserve side, they increased from 50 million to 71 million across the year, which is astounding, really. But there are technical reasons for that. In particular, £15 million of business rate reliefs that we received during 2021 doesn't get fed into the collection fund account until 21-22, so we have to treat that as an earmark reserve. So it's not one that we can actually use other than to offset the collection fund for business rates in 21-22. So that's inflated the position by 15 million. And we also received some external funding for the museum. So that too has inflated the earmark reserves, and that will be spent when the fit-out works start at the Sands Venue Hotel for the museum, and hopefully that will be imminently. The report goes into some detail on the unders and overs for each service, and perhaps I can answer some questions on that at the end of this. It's probably also worth mentioning about income collection, and certainly COVID has had an impact on our main income streams. If you look at council tax, in 1920, the collection rate in year was 91.5. That dropped considerably to 87.8% in 2021. That is the third lowest in the country. I was expecting it to be the lowest, but it is actually Liverpool and Hackney actually performed worse than that, and is a reflection of the difficulties in collecting council tax within the town. And when you think we have a shared service with Filed, so it's the same staff, it's the same managers, it's the same systems that collect the council tax, and yet we collected 87.8%. And Filed, we collected 95.2%. I think that's a really stark difference in collection rates with exactly the same resources being used to collect that. In terms of the collection rate for council tax reduction scheme claimants, so this is the council tax benefit scheme as was, very similar collection rate to the previous year, but of course such claimants received up to £150 in government support during 2021 because of COVID. And in terms of business rates, again, that's very similar reflection to the council tax. That dropped from 95.6% in 1920 to 85.8%, which is, again, a significant drop, but that is the 14th lowest in the country. And there's some interesting authorities below ourselves, including the likes of Kensington and Chelsea, for instance. So once we come out of lockdown and the economy improves, we will try to robustly catch up in collecting that council tax and business rates, with an emphasis on the ones who won't pay rather the ones who can pay rather than the ones who won't pay. And we're currently redrafting our income and debt recovery strategy alongside updating our fair debt policy and financial inclusion policy as well. And perhaps we'll bring this back to a future meeting if you're interested in that. Just thinking elsewhere within the report, what is stark is the list of COVID-related grants received from government last year, which comes to 166 million. I have with me the draft statement of accounts, which is currently 166 pages, but the way it's going, it's probably going to be over 200 pages. This refers to a lower figure of 159, if anybody makes the comparison. And I think the main reason for that is due to timing, because back in March 2020, we received a COVID grant of £6 million. So that actually sat in the 1920 accounts, even though it related to 2021. But 159, 166 million, still a significant sum. The government have supported the town across a whole range of areas. And a lot of that has continued into 21-22, certainly up to the first 4 months of the year in terms of business rate reliefs, compensation for sales fees and charges, and general unearmarked grant funding. So as I say, I mentioned the draft statement of accounts, which reflects the figures within here. We have a duty to put the draft statement of accounts on the website by the 1st of August. So we're just finalising this now, and should be able to sign those off next week. And then they will be subject to external audit. And the government deadline is the end of September for sign off of the final audited accounts, but the feedback from Deloitte is that they'll be looking at November. So we actually missed the deadline because they can't accommodate the deadlines within their work schedules. So I think that probably covers the main points from the outturn. Again, I'm happy to answer any specific questions or take any comments.
Thank you, Steve. Has anybody got any questions? Yes, Paula, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. My ears pricked up a bit there when you were saying about Deloitte not meeting the deadlines and not being able to fit into their work. I can't remember exactly what your words were, but surely they got the we employed them with the kind of agreement that they would meet those deadlines. So isn't that part of our agreement with them that they would do that, whatever?
The contract actually sits between the external auditor and public sector audit appointments, who then allocate auditors or lots of external audit to each local authority. But yes, our external audit fee is some £84,000, and we've done our side of the bargain in producing a draft set of accounts. So it's now up to them to provide the audit. It is an area that has placed more demands on external audit in recent years. The Financial Reporting Council, which is effectively the regulator for external audit, has put more burdens upon them, which has probably not been reflected in the price that they all bidded for. And of course, there are competing demands. Not only do they audit local government, but they also audit the NHS, further education, and so forth. And the fact that the deadlines are all aligned now, if you go back 10 years, it was always the NHS first, and then the academic year for the colleges, and then local government at the end. So at least they could spread their resource out across the year. But now it's all condensed and aligned on the same deadlines, which must be very difficult for them.
Thank you. Has anybody else got any questions? Right, Gerard, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
And then Michelle.
Okay, the first one is really more of an observation, really, and maybe more towards Councillor Leader Lynn Williams. Just with regards to the underspends that we've got on the communities and environmental services. So, for instance, you've got street cleaning, waste services made a saving of 800,000, an underspend of 138,000 on highways and traffic. Would it be a good time then with these underspends to focus more on the weeds and the state of the highways and the roads throughout the town? That's just an observation after seeing all the weeds that are currently impacting everybody. And secondly, Steve, just if you could, on the subsidiary companies, please, just give us a little bit of more of an insight into who those subsidiary companies are with the non-recoverable income streams. Thank you.
Yes.
Are you going first, Steve, or do you want me to?
If you don't mind, it'll buy me some time to think the answer to that one. Thank you.
I can see you hesitating. Yes, and I would hesitate to say great minds think alike, but that was obviously also the plan around, Envico in that to release monies to, and some has. Well, I can't probably say until Steve is he's looking down the side of his sofa, as they say, to try and kind of that. But there will hopefully be some sort of announcements, some changes as to how that's with the changes with Envico. But certainly looking, weeds, and alleys, and I think there's also part of it though. There has to be this community engagement. Yes, we need to keep the streets clean, but there's also nothing wrong with people looking after the front of their own bit of the street. This has to be, but I understand that we need to get sort of everything into kind of a state where a condition and a method or sort of regular routine for cutting grass and cleaning and weeding that then enables people to kind of take some control and of their environment and to feel that kind of that community responsibility for it without negating obviously the council's responsibility for that, if that makes any sense. So yes, absolutely.
Can I just come in on there, Chair, if I may?
Yes.
I believe civic pride, we need to bring that back on such a big high level. But for instance, with the ward I represent with Councillor Cox in Squiresgate, there are a lot of elderly people, some disabled people who can't get to the front of their pavements and the front of their highways. So we're trying to take that and help them personally, because we're quite fit and able people. But yeah, it's just that with the underspends, I'm just wondering if more resources could be channeled in that aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, some people won't, some people, but I think it's about trying to sort of encourage where people can, but I understand and appreciate that we need to make that commitment to sort of resolving those issues. I think also we can't blame it all on the weather, but we have had a particularly heightened lots of rain and then lots of sun, which is I can't believe my front garden. I thought I'd only pick those blooming weeds. I don't know what they're doing, but so yeah, and it is of course a battle as well against, particularly this year. I mean, the NEAT team are marvellous, but they have had maybe incredibly busy weekends because of the weather, when wouldn't necessarily be. It would have been waiting for the school holidays, but people have obviously took advantage for relaxation in restrictions, etc. As well as obviously their staff have been impacted as much as everybody else has by people having to isolate and illness, etc. So, but yes, we, as I say, hopefully we will be able to sort of. I know we've got the chair of Envico with us as well. So, but that will be. We'll hopefully make some kind of sort of put out there what the plans are and how everything is going to work, and and then there's also obviously I'm going on a bit. I'm giving you too much time, Steve, to think now, aren't I? But it's obviously to reinvigorate the alleyway project, which was support residents with their alleys, and that was ready to go. But obviously that was last March, so not at the best time, so that was shelved. But I think that is sort of quietly going to be reintroduced and people supported to see what we can hopefully achieve all together. Okay.
Thank you, Lynn. Steve, did you want to answer Gerard's last question?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, it's obvious now, but when we set the budget for 2021 back in January 2020, we'd still anticipated dividends from two companies, Blackpool Transport and Blackpool Operating Company at the Sandcastle. It's clear that from April onwards, it was unrealistic to expect that because in Blackpool Transport's case, they were only ferrying key workers in the early months, and in the case of the Sandcastle, they were actually closed until probably August, September. So
Thank
that's the
you.
main reason for that.
Michelle.
Thank you, Chair. It's disappointing again to see a significant overspend on children's services. I guess partially understandable given what we've all just been through. and are still going through. However, the same hasn't been the case for adult services, and it seems that a significant proportion of their underspend was on adults commissioning placements. I wonder if you could explain, Steve, for us why that should be the case, if you know.
I think in the main, a lot of the government support for COVID took over some of those costs. And whilst we made payments, we made a 10% premium to residential care providers. We also guaranteed a certain level of activity, which we have done through to the end of June this year, despite in some cases the number of clients reducing because of COVID. So the costs have gone up, but the grants that we've received from the government have compensated, and in some cases more than compensated.
And that wasn't the case for children's care then, I guess, or did we just have so much demand that we outstripped whatever grants we got?
We did. Some of the grants, have been applied to children's. We've done some considerable sort of forensic work, and in some cases it's quite subjective, trying to understand the reason why a child, for example, is taken into care. Is it a consequence of COVID, or is it something else? And it's quite a grey area. But we've applied as much as we possibly could in that area. And last June, we agreed a 5-year medium-term financial strategy and plan for children's social care. And that is starting to have an effect, not as rapidly as we'd like, and COVID hasn't helped in that regard, but we are seeing a levelling off now, certainly in the latter months of 2021. So a lot of that overspend was in the early months of 2021. So there are some green shoots.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. I've just got a couple of things, please, Steve. I notice here with the print service, once again, that there's an overspend. We're saying that it's mainly due to loss of income with COVID, but this has been coming up year after year after year, that the print service is overspent, and we don't seem to be able to get a grip on it at all. And then there's something else here, an 85k pressure on the illuminations due to increased costs relating to, increased maintenance. Is that because we're now leaving the illuminations up all year round? I mean, at one time we said it was absolutely vital to bring them down so that we could clean them and do the maintenance. But now, for quite some years, they've just been there on the promenade, year in, year out, exposed to all the elements.
I think there may be something in that, but if you leave that one with me, I will follow that one up with Alan, if that's okay, and let the committee know.
Right.
As regard the print unit, yes, there has been a history of overspending, but we thought we'd got that right. We've physically moved them from the basement of the municipal buildings to purpose-built offices on the corner of Cookson Street and Corn Street. So I do think for 2021, it probably is as a result of COVID. They will have received some income compensation from government that only covers 75%. So there will be an effect of that. But I'm hoping, going forward, they've got a more prominent position, and with the right marketing, they should get back into surplus.
Right, thank you. Has anybody else got any questions? No? Right. Thank you very much, Steve. You've had a very busy evening, but could I just thank you and all your staff? I think as a council, we're more than fortunate to have you as the director. Steady pair of hands, and you've also got some wonderful staff as well. So on behalf of this committee, could I just thank you all very much indeed? Thank you.
I shall relay that. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And if you're very good, you may go now.
Okay. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Can we turn now to item 5? This is the scrutiny work plan. Right, if we can go through them one by one for the scrutiny committees, and if the chair or vice chair of each committee would like to speak, So we'll start with tourism. Have you got anything to say on that? That's yours, Fred, isn't it? You've been thrown in at the deep end because you've not been doing the job very long. But I don't know if you want to say anything, or Gerard.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as you say, Maxine, I've only just recently taken over the chair, so it is finding my feet a little bit more than before. I was on the committee, but obviously not in touch as much as I would have liked to have been. So yes, we've met together as a committee, and we've decided on the things that we want to look at and progress with. And I'm very pleased with what we've put forward. And I think the whole committee supports those ideas, and that's the way we want to go. So I think just as brief as that for now.
All right, thank you, Fred. Have you anything to add, Gerard?
No, I think that's great. What Fred said, it's covered all the bases. You know, there's quite a lot to go through. It's been a difficult time with COVID, so we look forward to the reports in October and going forward.
Yes, I think we'll all look forward to a better year for our tourism. I'm sure it will be a different story next year at this time. Right, thank you to both of you.
Oops.
If we can turn now to children and young people, I think another case, Paula, of you being thrown in at the deep end, but have you got anything to say, or perhaps Andrew?
Well, Andrew, do you want to go first? I'm not sure if you can see me if I flick to my notes. Just let me know if you can still see me.
We could see you. Oh, you've gone now.
Right, okay. So I'll just say very quickly, we had a report from the young people, the young inspectors, and that was incredible. Nice. From the corporate parent panel, they were talking about establishing a training programme for them going forward, so that, because there are other young people who want to come up through and be trained to do that. And it seems to be working very well. Their opinions are valued and some of the observations are being taken on board. So it's great to see that developing. Other meetings coming through. We're having a follow-up meeting from the Blackpool Better Starts review, and also on inclusive schools. So that's certainly some developments there in terms of the information being gathered and the way forward. I'll pass back to Andrew.
Right, thank you, Paula. I did mention to Lynn how impressed we all were with the young inspectors. I did mention it to you in a call we had a couple of weeks ago. It really was a very, very interesting debate, and credit to them. They were wonderful. Yeah. Right, Andrew, have you anything to add?
Not really a lot to add, but I'd like to just reiterate that about the young inspectors. It does really mean that they are being listened to, and I think because of this, they want to get on board because it shows that we are listening. As far as the work plan's concerned, we've had quite a lot of shuffling around because of various different things and what we've classed as more important to get on the agenda sooner rather than later. We've got the SEND provision one coming up with the Oracle building. That should make a really good meeting, because that's something it's so much needed in the town, is the SEND. There's not really a lot more to add. It's still a fluid document because it changes depending on what comes through and how many changes there are with children's services. But it is always tried to keep up to date with what is the priority at that particular moment in time.
Right, thank you, Andrew. Now, if we can turn to adult social care, it's another case, Adrian, of you being thrown in. But have you anything to say, or Michelle? Thank you.
I think it's all the vice chairs know more about it than the chairs at the moment. No, we've had a couple of meetings with the work plan. It's a fairly detailed, comprehensive work plan for the adult social care. and we'll be going through it. Obviously, some of it is related to COVID, but there are so many changes that could be coming up with the adult health and the health authorities that we're going to have a busy few months, I think. And we've got a fairly detailed, extensive programme.
Thank you. Michelle, have you anything to add?
Only really to reiterate what Adrian's just said about the integrated care system and the integrated care partnership that's developing. That's going to be key for us, really, because it takes everything onto a very broad footprint across Lancashire and South Cumbria, with our own Blackpool, Fylde and Wyre specific integrated care partnership sitting beneath that, and the focus on the Adult Social Care and Health Committee, ever since I've been involved with everyone who's been on that committee, is making sure we get our fair share for Blackpool. So within the scrutiny process, that's what we'll be looking for. There are some key aspects such as mental health services, the drug-related death work that we've been doing. Public health and the recovery from COVID is really important. And a number of other things that have run through, really, with recurrent themes that are still in the plan and that we're keeping a very close eye on, together with the informal review work that we're doing on topics that have been raised that are of concern. So we might have had changes in the chairs, but everybody is on board with these work plans, and it's good that we're working together on them.
Right, thank you. Has anybody else any comments at all on any of the scrutiny committees? No? Right, thank you. We turn now to the date and time of the next meeting, which will be Thursday, the 16th of September. So it's a little while off, but something to look forward to. It's nice to see you here this evening, Lynn. You're very welcome. And good night to everybody, and thank you for attending. Thank you. Bye.